Noah Khogali is here. Noah, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Shall we start with the Daily Telegraph? This does sort of play into their readership, I guess we could suggest. But what do you make of sort of the row that's developed over what may or may not happen this coming Saturday in terms of this tension of potentially a pro-Palestinian march and Armistice Day commemorations?
Yeah, this is an incredibly complicated one because I think as a society, and especially for their readership, it is trying to find a balance between what are our nations. We're quite proud of our liberal values of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and with that obviously comes the right to protest. But also of a country that does like law and order. We don't want fights breaking out in the streets. We don't want this to turn into a massive brawl on a day that is supposed to be a day of remembrance, and that is the complicated balance that the police are going to have to find here. So Mark Rowley can request permission from the Home Secretary to cancel the protest if he believes there's going to be serious disorder, and if that's something that I think the public think is probably going to be quite likely. So if he believes that as well, he can request Suella Braverman to give him the permission to cancel the protest. And if we see that, I think we'll see, people obviously of, that mind that may be going to the protest outraged, but also those that are serious proponents of, the unequivocal right to free speech also be equally upset.
What do you think Rishi Sunak's real motivations are here? So we know that he wrote that letter to Sir Mark Rowley on Friday saying, look, the force had the powers necessary to ensure that protests didn't disrupt or disturb acts of remembrance. It was quite a lengthy letter, actually, that he wrote. Is this for him about genuine concern about what's happening on Saturday? Or is there a little bit of it that is part of the PR sort of element of this that's saying to the public, look, I'm going to make sure that I'm on your side here?
There actually may be one and the same in this situation. I think very rarely are the eyes of the entire country outside of London on the streets of London, and are looking at footage daily of train stations where people sitting with poppies are getting hounded out of train stations. That doesn't normally happen, and because the entire country is watching London, and maybe watching those Remembrance Day parades and celebrations is the wrong word, but commemorations. That makes it a really important time to make sure that London looks good. If the only time in the year potentially where somebody was to look at the streets of London and they were to see essentially violence and tension, that is a very, very, very bad look. And I think we've seen over the past few days, week potentially, that these tensions have been slowly rising, and there has been a lack of speaking out by politicians about often what is really going on at these marches, which is there's lots of people that are there and potentially not really realising what they're being a part of. And then you see these signs popping up every so often that, maybe have a swastika on or have a very, very bad slogan on. And you're seeing them more and more and more, potentially because people feel like they're essentially being given a free path to spread anti-Semitic hate. And these things have gone way beyond as just anti-Zionism, which is often used as a cover-up for anti-Semitism. And because the police and politicians have been reluctant to step in, you're now seeing these things go further. And I think that's the concern about this weekend, is that if you put cameras and microphones right there, that things are only going to get worse.
This sort of plays a part in the comment piece that Trevor Phillips has written in The Times today, the headline being, "This war has exposed the worst in tribalism." He says many of us balance several strands of identity, but occasionally one attribute rises above all, and the result can be dangerous. What is sort of the argument that he's making here, and do you agree with him?
It's an incredibly interesting piece, and he makes a comparison to sport within it. And that he lived near Stamford Bridge and felt the fear of that football tribalism, and that's quite an apt comparison. I think you've seen people that have had no real interest in the Middle East, or the really complicated affairs of that area, but they are taking up these chants like one would at a football game. So you've got people chanting from the river to the sea without really understanding what that means. It's just something that they've heard people chant that they're now perceiving to be on their side, maybe just because they want to support what they see as an underdog. And you've got people injecting themselves into this scenario like it's a sports match. And it's incredibly weird, but also incredibly dangerous. And we need to make it very clear to people. People need to understand, especially in the age of social media and, TikTok and especially pastel-coloured Instagram, infographics, that this is an incredibly complicated scenario that you cannot summarize, in 15 seconds or in one picture. And this isn't something you should just be randomly injecting yourself into and just going along with whatever chant you hear on the day, because you might be chanting something that is essentially calling for, the genocide of the Israeli people. And that's the point, I think, that he highlights, is that people are injecting themselves into this situation when they really probably shouldn't be, if they sit down and think about what they're, even by accident, now supporting.
Is that fair? I think a lot of the people who are demonstrating and protesting will feel hugely aggrieved, and that would be an understatement.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think lots of people that have traditionally become the voices in the UK of international affairs worldwide probably don't actually know a lot of the time who they're marching for. I think if you go to those protests, you're seeing a lot more, pro-Hamas flags than a person that is going with what they perceive goodwill would like to, and that's the problem, is that there is a very, very blurred line, I think, between those who are using these protests to stand up for a people who they truly believe is suffering and they truly believe needs support, and those who are using it as a cover for anti-Semitism and pro-Hamas support. It's a very, very blurred line, and that's the problem here. I don't think people in the UK really have. There is no problem with supporting, Palestinian people who have suffered brutally under Hamas and who have needed that support from the international community and maybe haven't always got it. And those who are actually supporters of Hamas, they're showing up at the same place, unfortunately. And I think that's the problem here.
It is one thing that Labour and the Conservative Party are united on in terms of their support of Israel to defend themselves, but not calling for a ceasefire. That's the thing that's got Starmer into a little bit of trouble with some of the people within his party who've resigned as a result because they're unhappy. We're going to hear a lot of politics this week because, of course, it's this King's Speech tomorrow. Inside the Times, they've sort of enjoyed looking at some of the policies that we might be hearing from the Conservative Party that would pose a problem for Keir Starmer. What do you think they're going to be?
Yeah, so it seems quite obvious now, I think, that there's going to be a real focus on both law and order and in rolling back some of the net zero environmental commitments that we've seen over the past while. So I think law and order is going to be a real focus at the moment, obviously because it's something that's in the news. And we saw at party conference, obviously, Rishi Sunak talking about that smoking ban. So that's going to be one of them. But Suella Braverman's homelessness, I wouldn't call it yet a crisis within the party, but her comments over the weekend regarding homelessness being a lifestyle choice and giving powers to councils to remove tents that are being a nuisance, I think the word is, have already provoked, I think, outrage from the TRG, who are the Tory Reform group, who are the One Nation Conservative group within the parliamentary party and are quite a sizable group of MPs. They're obviously not happy, but this is, I think, they're going to try and draw Labour out into the policy open, where they have been reluctant to be over the past 18 months, 2 years.
Yeah.
And try and get them to say things, I think, about policy and go into the depths of policy for the first time in a while, which is something I think they think they're probably less strong on than the broad rhetoric that has led them to having a poll advantage over the Tories.
What do you make of Suella Braverman's sort of homelessness strategy?
I think it's an interesting one in terms of that it gives red meat to the people it's strong rhetoric, but it also pushes the incentive to do anything onto councils. So the government can kind of hold their hands up, if this turns out incredibly badly and go, well, it was the councils that did it, not us. And councils will always appreciate having more power to do things locally. There's always something councils are going to like having to do. But this is also quite a strong stance on an issue that people will get very emotional about. Whether it is actually as necessary as Suella Braverman has suggested it is a whole other story. I think the TRG's line was, "This is not San Francisco," who have had very, very public problems with tent towns or tent villages and these hundreds and thousands of tents. That's not something we're really seeing in the UK. And the rumours are that the actual changes to law are going to essentially be around what is a nuisance and what isn't. So just removing tents that are in, say, shop doorways, which is much, much less of a serious policy change than the rhetoric would make it sound like.
Yeah, of course. And that's often the case. Final thing I want to ask you very quickly before you go, Noah, is there's an interesting story inside the Times about Amsterdam, because it was surprising at the time when they announced a policy that was they were going to stop encouraging people to go on holiday there because they were so concerned about sort of overcrowding and maybe the behaviour of potentially British tourists when we arrived in Amsterdam. It turns out the policy is working.
Yeah, so arrivals from Britain are down 22% after a cap on essentially flight landings. The airlines are obviously not particularly happy because that very much hurts their pocket. But it's something that if you go to Amsterdam, it's incredibly crowded. It's not actually very big, and because of the system of canals and the way that lots of Dutch cities are set up, it's not one that's overly conducive to crowds. There is always that risk of tumbling into a canal, which would obviously not be an ideal way to spend your holiday, just kind of wet traipsing around Amsterdam. So I'm not really surprised that this is a policy that they've undertaken. And I'm quite glad for them that it's a policy that's working. I think they've reaped the benefits of tourism, but they're also protecting the people of Holland. I can't imagine it's particularly nice to live in Amsterdam at the moment. If you're just a regular person trying to live your life and you've got these thousands of potentially very, very drugged up sex tourists traipsing around, that's not a particularly nice experience if you're living there, I suppose.
Yeah, this year, not only did they sort of not advertise Amsterdam, they discouraged people from going. A digital discouragement campaign warning young British sex and drug tourists to stay away. So basically saying, you're not welcome. Maybe the stag do will have to find a new location. Noah, thank you so much. Noah Khogali, researcher and, political commentator with Young Voices UK. Really appreciate your time.